Hello, this video is part 3 in a series answering the question, what is gender? The last 2 parts covered gender theories from the 20th century. I hope that all parts of this series can stand on their own, but I do recommend watching the previous videos before this one.
Well, I'm Ted Cruz, and my pronoun is kiss my ass.
It's amazing how strongly people feel about that. You see them talking about cutting taxes, people go like that. Talk about transgender, everyone goes crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago you didn't know what the hell it was?
One of my favorite philosophy quotes is from jazz musician Miles Davis. It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. When a text doesn't mention certain people, the author is saying a lot by saying nothing. One topic has been conspicuously absent from the previous 2 videos. Trans people and their importance in gender theory is the topic of this video. Last video discussed performativity theory, which argues that gender is not the social meaning of sex, but a process of doing that creates the illusion of gender identity. This makes us agents in creating our own gender, but this performance is still heavily regulated by social factors. Performativity theory remains radical and controversial today, but the conversation has shifted in the 30 years since Judith Butler's Gender Trouble was published. Today, when gender is the topic of conversation, we aren't usually asking about women's oppression, but about transgender people. That is why many people are even aware that some people use sex and gender differently. Early feminists did discuss trans people, but trans issues were not as politically central or charged as in the 20th century as they are today. But trans people are important. We should discuss their unique challenge for gender theory. Philosopher Jennifer McKitrick asked an important question about the theories I discussed in the first 2 videos. What about dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is the psychological distress that some trans people experience when their gender identity doesn't match their assigned sex at birth. Or shorter, dysphoria refers to one's negative relationship with their body because it doesn't match their gender identity. According to McKitrick, correct accounts of gender from video 1 can't explain dysphoria because they make gender entirely about other people. Psychology and self-identity isn't relevant in these accounts because they say gender is about socialization. McKitrick does find value in Butler's performativity theory from video 2. Although performativity theory rejects the concept of an internal gender identity, it still says that individuals have a gender identity. Your identity is just constructed by your gender behavior. However, McKitrick thinks performativity doesn't have enough to explain dysphoria.
There are times when men and women are not engaging in any gendered behavior. Sometimes they are not behaving at all, or they are behaving in ways that are not gender specific. But they do not, at those times, cease to be gendered. I would further argue that one could be feminine while exhibiting patterns of masculine behavior for extended periods of time, and vice versa.
McKitrick proposes extending Butler's performativity theory to include not only actions, but dispositions. A disposition is defined as being prone to act in certain ways in certain circumstances. For example, a glass cup has the disposition to be fragile. It will likely shatter, an action, when struck, in a circumstance. McKitrick connects dispositions and conditional statements. If this glass were struck, it would shatter. Has a very similar meaning to this glass is fragile. She highlights 5 marks of dispositionality, which you can pause and read if you're interested in a more rigorous definition of disposition. Similar to performativity theory, in the dispositional account, gender is about actions performed in certain circumstances. Key to note about dispositions, however, is that one might have a disposition to act in a certain way without actually acting that way. Also note that gender is not a disposition in this account, but a cluster of sufficiently strong dispositions. These dispositions may manifest as gendered actions in certain circumstances, but can exist even if those circumstances never occur, and therefore the actions never occur. McKitrick predicts a problem. Isn't this essentializing gender? The important part of Butler's performativity theory was that gender was not an expression of an internal identity, but something performed that gives the illusion of an internal identity. But if gender is a cluster of dispositions, then our gender is just an expression of those dispositions, which are internal instead of social. In the last video, Linda Nicholson and Yoyowomi Onyeronke warned us of the dangers of essentializing gender this way. On the contrary, McKitrick claims the dispositional account fulfills Butler's beliefs about gender performance. Social conditioning restricts our gendered acts. Socialization takes our random actions and guides us through rewards and punishments, which disposes us to behave in certain ways. This explains differences in gender, or lack thereof, across cultures, since cultures reward or punish different actions in different ways for different reasons. There's no reason to believe that certain dispositions are intrinsic to one gender or sex. They are shaped by society and will change in different contexts and over time. McKitrick uses a traffic light as a helpful analogy. A traffic light has certain dispositions and narrow actions it can cause. It can only emit certain electromagnetic radiation in certain circumstances. But the traffic light's ability to create, for example, a red light depends not only on the traffic light, but the ability of observers to perceive and experience red. And even given that, only in certain circumstances will that red light actually influence people's actions in response. So a traffic light has intrinsic dispositions, but its dispositions to cause people to stop or go, and even to be a traffic light, depends on social context, and is thus an external disposition. Similarly with gender. A person may have intrinsic dispositions, but their disposition to be a boy or a girl or something else entirely depends on social context, perceptions, and culture. These dispositions are external, and more so than the traffic light, they are shaped by socialization, which rewards and punishes certain actions. What's more, one's gender can change depending on the social circumstances. McKitrick's dispositional account is, of course, not the only account of gender that addresses trans people. One common understanding of gender, transgender, and dysphoria is what philosopher Talia Bettcher calls the wrong body model.
Transsexuality is a misalignment between gender identity and sexed body. At its most extreme, the idea is that one's real sex, given by internal identity, is innate. It is on the basis of this identity that one affirms that one has always really belonged to a particular sex and has a claim to the surgical procedures that brings one's body into alignment with one's identity.
The wrong body model is a common way for people to understand gender and sexuality. Bettcher claims gender theorists like Julia Serrano and Jay Prosser defend this view. Maybe you already see some red flags. While the wrong body model affirms the reality of dysphoria, it makes gender an innate psychological feature rather than a socially constructed or imposed one. It implies a psychological difference between men and women that sexual biological features of our bodies have a correct gender, which, rather than affirming trans people identities, serves to undermine them. It would mean trans people must want surgery in order to be one gender or another, which is not true for many trans people. Instead, let's discuss something more popular in trans communities. Talia Bettcher calls this the transgender model. This account says that trans people challenge the traditional binary between man and woman. It is not trans people who are the problem, but society itself. Another gender scholar, Robin Dembroff, has written about the transgender experience. Dembroff's view differs because they believe that transgender is not only an identity. Some people identify as transgender, many more people experience transgender. Transgender experience is the experience of engaging in forms of self-directed gender nonconformity that are heavily penalized. Dembroff emphasizes heavily penalized to deflect criticisms that this definition applies to everyone in the world. Nobody lives up to the perfect ideal of masculinity or femininity, but some people are penalized much more for their nonconformity. People who identify as transgender are one example, and so are many people who exist outside of the binary. More on that later. Or they choose to continually challenge gender roles. In this way, Dembroff challenges the binary between transgender and cisgender, and insists that there is a spectrum between transgender and cisgender experience, based on how one challenges traditional gender and the degree they are penalized for it. But Bettcher has an issue with the transgender model. Some trans people do not challenge the gender binary. Some trans people are quite comfortable with the binary genders of man or woman, but their gender doesn't match their sex assigned at birth. The transgender model undermines the claims of these so-called binary trans people. Another issue haunts both the transgender and wrong body models. Both are single meaning positions. They posit that a gender, like woman, has a single meaning that applies across contexts. Given what we've learned, this seems unlikely. Gender is clearly highly dependent on social circumstances, and a consistent meaning of woman or man across contexts seems absurd. Bettcher's account is straightforward. Someone is a trans woman if they identify as a woman and were assigned as male at birth. That's a pretty uncontroversial definition of trans woman. The more controversial step is when Bettcher says that trans women are women. They are just one of the types of women. Rather than trying to find unifying features of cis women and trans women, let's just simply say both are women. Words can mean whatever we want, and this usage is already common in certain communities. So let's just say it. Trans women are women. Cis women are also women. There are multiple meanings of the word woman, and we don't have to make cis women the paradigm and trans women the edge case. Both are paradigmatic, why do I put words I don't know how to say in my script? Both are paradigmatic examples of women.
Paradigmatic.
Okay, this is silly, right? Sure, words are made up, but we can't just change the meanings of words however we want. To better understand what Bettcher is trying to do, I think we should go back to Rob and Dembroff in their article, Real Talk on the Metaphysics of Gender. Dembroff's argument challenges a common assumption that we have overlooked about the meaning of gender. We, being trans-affirming advocates, argue that the transphobes are wrong, that gender doesn't mean what they think it means. We make arguments that gender is a social construct and doesn't map neatly onto sex. We claim that the real meaning of gender affirms self-identification of trans people's gender, that it can't be reduced to biology. But why? Why should we think that? Why should the real meaning of gender be trans-affirming? Again, words are defined socially, and English-speaking societies seem pretty transphobic overall, so we should expect the dominant meaning of the word gender to be transphobic as well. Dembroff calls this the ontological oppression, and gives the example of athlete. In the past, only certain people were considered athletes. Progressives at the time might have believed that women could compete and that black people should be part of teams and that people with disabilities deserved a league. However, under the dominant usage at the time, it was technically inaccurate to say that women, black people, and people with disabilities were athletes. The word athlete excluded and oppressed certain groups of people. It would be missing the point to have argued semantics and said, actually, women are athletes because of such and such. Instead, people argued that the word athlete should not be used in an exclusionary and oppressive way. We should adopt a new meaning that includes more people.
Historical examples abound of assertions that were true because of pernicious social kinds. In the 19th century, speakers in the United States could truly claim, "Women cannot vote," or "This slave is my property." Hindsight tells us not that these claims were false, but that they were wrong. Similarly, when we take the possibility of gender-related ontological oppression seriously, we should expect that there are many true gender classifications that are true because of oppressive gender kinds. Or, to approach this point from a slightly different angle, even if speakers in trans-exclusive contexts get an individual's gender metaphysically correct relative to the operative kinds, they still get gender writ large normatively wrong.
You can see where this is going. Instead of arguing that the dominant meaning of woman is inclusive of trans women, let's argue for expanding the meaning of woman to a non-oppressive one. We can pull from Sally Haslanger once again. We discussed Haslanger back in part 1 when talking about coat rack views of gender. We noted her definition of gender's similarity to her definition of race. For both race and gender, Haslanger explains that she is taking an analytical approach, which she means
the task is not to explicate our ordinary concept, nor is it to investigate the kind that we may or may not be tracking with our everyday conceptual apparatus. Instead, we begin by considering more fully the pragmatics of our talk employing the terms in question. What is the point of having these concepts? What cognitive or practical tasks do they, or should they, enable us to accomplish? Are they effective tools to accomplish our legitimate purposes? If not, what concepts would serve these purposes better?
I like this. I was critical of Haslanger in part 1, but she wrote that in 1997, and now it's 2023. I think our gender and feminist goals have shifted. While women's liberation is still important, we now also include trans liberation. I think, and I hope Dr. Haslanger agrees, we should adopt meanings of gender that direct us towards this goal. The dominant usage of gender likely is oppressive or unjust, but there are others that we can use. Dembroff proposes 2 ideas for replacing ontologically oppressive meanings. The first, which they call the bootstrapping approach, is something like Haslanger's approach. We look at what justice requires and analyze what promotes autonomy, fulfillment, and other things we want from gender. Alternatively, Dembroff proposes the imitation approach. Here we look at how gender is used in trans-inclusive, or better, trans-liberatory contexts, and take that meaning as our own. We work to make the trans-inclusive version of gender into the dominant meaning of gender. This is where Bettcher's multiple meaning definition of women comes into play. The usage she advocates, where women has 2 meanings that include cis women and trans women, is what she sees often in trans communities. It also sets trans women as a paradigm example of women, instead of pushing them to the margins.
The demand for justification and the demand for illumination are not the same. We need new accounts, I believe, that don't begin with a justification for trans self-identity claims, but that follow subcultural practice in taking the presumptive legitimacy of such claims for granted. This requires recognizing multiplicity of resistant meanings rather than acquiescing to the dominant culture's erasure of them.
It is possible that in the process of turning a meaning used by an oppressed minority into the dominant meaning used by the majority, it will lose some of its liberatory power. But that shouldn't stop us from trying. It may just be that our work is never done, and we will constantly have to make gender trouble in order to achieve liberation.
To make trouble was, within the reigning discourse of my childhood, something one should never do, precisely because that would get one in trouble. The rebellion and its reprimand seem to be caught up in the same terms, a phenomenon that gave rise to my first critical insight into the subtle ruse of power. The prevailing law threatened one with trouble, even put one in trouble, all to keep one out of trouble. Hence, I concluded that trouble is inevitable, and the task, how best to make it, what best way to be in it.
In other words, gender trouble will find you. You can either make it or be in it. Or more simply, be gay, do crimes. A key theme in gender studies is binaries and challenging binaries. We began by challenging the sex binary between males and females, in which intersex people and the inconsistency of secondary sex characteristics made it seem much more like a spectrum. Then we questioned the binary between gender and sex, asking if they were really so distinct after all. Sex turned out to be just as socially constructed as gender. We went further, and we briefly investigated the binary between transgender and cisgender, and discovered that some people who aren't transgender might still have a transgender experience. Again, we see that we have a spectrum, this time between trans and cis. Philosophy, science, and experience teach us to always question binaries. Every time we think we can separate things into 2 distinct groups, nature always finds a way to mess up our neat little boxes. So let's go beyond the binary. Let's talk non-binary. If you are not familiar, a non-binary gender is one that falls outside the man-woman gender binary. Sometimes it's thought of being between man and woman, but non-binary people fall outside the spectrum entirely. Some people identify as agender, meaning they have no gender at all. Sometimes the word genderqueer is used as a synonym for non-binary. Both of these can be thought of as umbrella terms for the various genders people use that are not man or woman. But let's avoid yet another binary. Perhaps there isn't a hard distinction between non-binary and binary genders. Not only do some people fall along a spectrum between binary and non-binary, and can identify as non-binary man or a non-binary woman, some people continuously move along this binary and are called gender fluid.
People who are gender fluid are people whose gender expression and/or gender identity don't park in any one place, or at least not for long. A gender fluid person may have a gender identity or internal sense of themselves that sits still, for example, woman, man, non-binary, etc., while still moving all along the masculinity-femininity spectrum, including both, neither, or androgyny in the middle, in their gender expression.
Why are non-binary genders and gender fluidity important to our discussion? 3 reasons. First, if we wish to understand what gender is, then we should analyze ways gender appears in our society, and non-binary genders are increasingly common. Second, I have a personal stake in talking about this. I consider myself gender fluid. I like to say that I am a man part-time. The third reason is related. I believe non-binary genders are a subversive challenge to the dominant and oppressive gender system in the US and so-called Western cultures. I wish I was brave enough to act more gender fluid in my life, but our world is so structured around the natural view of gender that it can be scary and difficult. Dembroff describes being genderqueer as a critical gender kind, by which they mean it destabilizes dominant gender ideology in our society. So if we are following Haslanger's lead and trying to find or create the meaning of gender that directs us most towards liberation, we should consider this extremely subversive type of gender. One that challenges all the binaries and frees people to express themselves however they feel. Recognizing the existence of non-binary people is important. Dembroff described the discrimination non-binary people face with a few examples.
As of 2018, every state requires binary gender markers to be assigned at birth, and only 4 states and Washington, D.C. allow persons to later select a non-binary gender marker. Non-binary people are discriminated as unintelligible in the medical, workplace, educational, and other social domains. These facts suggest that, within most dominant contexts, non-binary gender kinds simply do not appear. While non-binary identities are recognized within trans-inclusive communities, these identities have no home within dominant contexts where everyone is forced into one of 2 binary kinds, men and women.
Despite the increasing prevalence and representation within gender studies of non-binary people, not a lot of philosophy has been written about non-binary/genderqueer people. This is a shame because non-binary people offer some counters and paradigms for certain views of gender. Is non-binary an external or internal identity? How do we understand performativity when one's gender has no gender script? Can one have a socialized disposition to be genderqueer? What concept of non-binary points us towards liberation? These questions and more raised by non-binary genders hasn't been thoroughly addressed in the philosophy literature, although it is being discussed in LGBT communities and subcultures. In addition, non-binary genders, if we can call them that, have existed outside the West for millennia, and the absence of non-binary genders reflects academic philosophy's whiteness. Future philosophy will need to accommodate these critical gender kinds if it wishes to get an accurate account of gender both within the West and globally. Gender, if we do think it exists, has something to do with social constructs. It might somehow be related to enforcing heterosexuality, oppressing women, performativity to stay intelligible, dispositions, or whatever. But it's definitely something social. As something social, it should not surprise us to find there are different concepts of gender, as we have seen across many different cultures outside the West. It shouldn't surprise us, as Talia, Bettcher, and Dembroff informed us, that there are many different concepts of gender within subcultures, some of which support or oppose the dominant view in that society. Therefore, it seems uncontroversial to claim that there are multiple correct meanings of gender. We call this pluralism in philosophy. Although it's uncontroversial, it's important to discuss, because even if one meaning of gender seems correct or fits your experience, that doesn't exclude the legitimacy of another meaning. Pluralism can be scary sometimes, because we might have to admit that certain oppressive views of gender are legitimate usages. Dembroff claims that one such example is the dominant one used in the USA. And this means that from a certain perspective, it might be correct to say that a trans woman is not a woman, or that non-binary is not a legitimate way to identify your gender. It seems wrong to give transphobes the room to say, well, from my perspective, you're not really a man. But in the recognition of pluralism, how do we deal with this? Bettcher addresses this problem with an analogy. According to evangelical Christianity, I am a sinner. In lots of ways. I am not an evangelical Christian, though, and I reject the worldview that such a Christianity is built on. I think it's false that I am a sinner because I think the entire worldview that the label sinner comes from is false. However, it would be kind of silly for me to argue that they're wrong about me being a sinner from within their worldview. Of course I am. We can also apply this logic to transphobic views about gender.
A trans woman can reject as false the claim that she is really a man by rejecting the entire system of gender in which that claim is true. On the multi-meaning view, a trans woman can say that she is a woman in all legitimate contexts because those contexts in which she is not a woman occur in a dominant culture that has been rejected for the reasons mentioned above. She can argue that the very belief and context in which she counts as a man, for example, a context in which genital structure is relevant, rests on the assumption that penises are male and is therefore grounded in a vision that marginalizes trans women from the start.
Pluralism doesn't require that we accept every possible usage as acceptable. Not every meaning of gender aligns with justice or is morally right. Similar to our discussion of Dembroff's ontological oppression and the word athlete from earlier, we can challenge and reject certain views of gender as unjust and/or based on a false worldview. The lesson of pluralism, however, is that there may be multiple acceptable views of gender, even without the boundaries of justice. Gender may be usefully constructed as a cluster of dispositions in one context, as a psychological identity in another, or even a political coalition united for gender liberation. We are at the end of this video, and I'm still not done. We've caught up to the present day, so there's only one way to go from here. In the next video, we'll discuss the future of gender. Let's summarize some main points in this video. First, 20th century discussions of gender, while acknowledging the existence of trans and sometimes even non-binary people, tended to focus on how gender oppressed women. The 21st century is much more characterized by a focus on trans people. We had three main characters in this discussion. Jennifer McKitrick, who modified performativity theory to accommodate for the experience of gender dysphoria. Talia Bettcher, who looked for a meaning of women that did not make trans people a marginal case, but a paradigmatic example. This led us back to Sally Haslanger, who provided us the concept of adopting a meaning of gender that was expedient for liberation. And finally, Robin Dembroff, whose insights into non-binary genders and pluralism provided us with new ways to subvert oppressive gender ontologies. All of this will guide our discussion of the future of gender in the next video. See you then.
A gunshot at a gender reveal party sparked the $8 million fire.
Start backing up!
The target, packed with a blue and an explosive powder, ignited the blaze when the expecting father, an off-duty Border Patrol agent, fired his rifle. It took 600 firefighters weeks to control.
Zalta.